Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you can just touch it. You can just. Even touch it. You can just touch it.
I'll come there.
You do that.
I'll come there. No, I've got up now.
I'm right behind you. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Why are you right behind me?
Aditya, present her the, on behalf of the Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Committee, Aditya and I would like to present Angavastram to Romila ji. On behalf of the India International Centre and the Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Committee, I, Suhas Borker, have the privilege of welcoming you to the third Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Lecture. Professor Romila Thapar, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, Dr. Aditya Malik, IIC President Ambassador Shri Shyam Saran, IIC Life Trustee Shri N.N. Vora. Our last two speakers who gave the first and second Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Lectures, Professor Anvita Abhi, who is online, and Shri Ashok Vajpayee, IIC Director Shri K.N. Shrivastava, fellow members of IIC, ladies and gentlemen. To repeat an oft repeated phrase linking Kapilaji and IIC, we are honoring an institution within an institution today. We have two very distinguished personalities doing the honors. Our speaker, Professor Romila Thapar, pre-eminent historian, Professor Emerita, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Thapar's academic rigor, Professor Thapar's academic rigor, emphasizing a scientific approach to history and evidence-based analysis, has influenced generations of historians in India and abroad. Our chair, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, Life Trustee of IIC, Dr. Aditya Malik, founding Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences, Laksha University, and nephew of Kapilaji, who shall give the closing remarks. I promised Professor Thapar that all of us shall be very brief. I shall keep that promise and just take a few minutes. Today, you have Professor Romila Thapar giving the Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Lecture. Here, we have two of India's most distinguished women scholars in humanities during the 20th and early 21st centuries, both pioneers in their respective fields. Professor Thapar in ancient Indian history and Dr. Vatsyayan in arts, dance, and cultural studies, both stars in India's intellectual landscape, with their paths intersecting in the broader Nehruvian ecosystem of post-independence India, both contributing immensely to India's post-colonial cultural renaissance. Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan relentlessly pursued the project of making IIC a thought space. Kapila ji was the keeper of the liberal, democratic, plural, inclusive, intellectual flame, and Kapila ji kept that flame alive at IIC for 32 years till her last breath with single-minded devotion. When you talk of IIC as a thought space, you cannot but recognize the contribution of Shri Romesh Thapar, Professor Thapar's elder brother, who created Socratic spaces, to use Shiva Viswanathan's phrase, in IIC. As the director of the center from 1967 to 1973, 7 years, these Socratic spaces were created for the pedagogy of citizenship, and Romesh Thapar realized that power which was not interrogated became arrogant. But this could be done in convivial spaces. Convivial spaces could become virtually confrontational. But Romesh Thapar accepted the necessity of it and had the courage to sustain it. It should be noted that as director IIC, Romesh Thapar drew a token honorarium of just 1,000 rupees per month for 7 years. When in February 2022, with the support of Shri Vora, the then IIC president, we set up 14 sectoral policy groups on national issues ranging from agriculture to history, from economic affairs to education, from media to social affairs. We were recreating those Socratic spaces at IIC which Romesh Thapar had created in the 1960s and 1970s. By the way, the last group, Social Affairs, under my convenership, has taken up the study of hate speech and has 8 papers which are ready up for discussion. But these groups have still a long way to go in recreating those Socratic spaces at IIC which were envisioned by Romesh Thapar. I would like to end with what IIC was thought of, what IIC thought space meant in those days. The story goes that the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi asked her principal secretary, the principal secretary Prime Minister P.N. Haksar, ये तो सब ठीक है हक्सर साहिब, but IIC इसके बारे में क्या सोचता है? The lecture of Professor Romila Thapar today, I am sure, shall take those Socratic spaces forward at IIC. I thank you. Dr. Meenakshi Gopi.
Good evening, friends. President of IIC, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Trustees Shri N.N. Vora, Professor Verma, Mr. Ashwajit Singh, family of Kapila ji, and Dr. Aditya Malik, and of course, the one and only Professor Romila Thapar, and the Karta Dharta of this initiative, Suhas Borker. It is really a privilege that today's event, the third Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Lecture, is being delivered by the iconic Professor Romila Thapar, who will speak on the present colonizes our past, the future forsaken. Congratulations and thanks to the Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Committee, especially to the intrepid Shri Suhas Borker, whose tireless efforts to honor Kapilaji's memory and foreground the warp and weft of discourse that interrogates the monocultures of the mind, deserve our deep appreciation. Kapilaji herself would have heartily approved. And I will not be as brief as Mr. Borker. As a long-time life trustee of this institution, Kapilaji strove ceaselessly to protect its autonomy, nurture an ethos of reasoned dialogue and a tradition of public reasoning that reflected the most expansive embodiment of her idea of India. For her, the IIC was not just a place where ideas grow, as our logo says. She sought to craft it as, and I quote her friend Margaret Chatterjee, a center that is alive, peopled, and busy, not a fixed point at all. It is where we stand and from where we reach out. It is where roads converge and from where roads branch out. It is a place for all seasons, winds, storm, and healing rain, and where the dry earth is watered and the mind's gardens bloom anew. For me personally, it is a singular honor to be here and share the days with Professor Romila Thapar, whom I have long admired, and I'm still completely in awe of her, as I'm sure many in the audience are. So I start with a disclaimer. I have neither the temerity nor the credentials by way of either scholarship or erudition to chair a talk by her. So I have redefined my role as a follow-up to Suhas's opening remarks. I know of no other scholar of her stature who has her astonishing ability to cut through verbiage and communicate concisely, almost aphorism-like, almost koan-like, protean ideas, chiseled and distilled through years of research, introspection, revising, refining, sculpting, making them exciting and accessible. I recall what Dr. Thapar said at a C.D. Deshmukh lecture, and the aphorism has stayed with me. History is essential to nationalism, as poppy is to the opium addict, she said, and I end quote. She spoke then also of syndicated nationalism. She spoke of religious nationalism that is a takeoff, really, from colonial writers such as James Mill. In one pithy sentence, she conjures up a whole universe of analysis and meaning. She highlights the layers of discrimination and exclusion that have been hardwired into the elite notions of Indian culture and even heritage. There are many, many Romila Thaparisms, and I have a whole compendium of them, and I would suggest that IIC publish them. Professor Thapar is, I believe, to the understanding of contemporary Indian history, and I'm sure many agree with me here today, what Panini may have been to language or Patanjali to yoga. And of course, Kapilaji, ever the polymath, very much like Abhinava Gupta, straddling the expanse of poetry, music, drama, theology, logic, the whole expanse. To paraphrase from the acclaimed Hindi poet Ashok Vajpayee, and I don't know if he's here, both Kapilaji and Professor Thapar steered an unceasing, unstoppable, interminable satyagraha against homogenization, totalization, uniformity, and learnt the importance of singing, especially in dark times. To Kapilaji, my personal debt is profound. She was a revered, almost venerated, almost mythical font of wisdom for me, an object of my adulation. I was privileged to have the benefit of her indulgence and affection from my college days. We shared a Bharatnatyam guru in the indomitable Lalita Shastri of the Adyar school. Kapilaji would drive to class after a long day at work in the ministry in what I remember was her standard Herald car. And as soon as she entered the practice space, it would be filled with the effulgence of an energy that could only have come from deep sadhana, distilled over the many years through her padayatras, through the length and breadth of India, her stay at temples, at shrines, at monasteries, and through her Vad, Vivad, and Samvad with many gurus, legendary masters, and spiritual masters, some known, some less known. She generously shared her insights on the Gita Govindam and the Natya Shastra, and she shared with us her interpretations of Indian art through concepts like Akasha, Kala, Akara, Bhava, and Rasa, and the relationship which she always emphasized between the microcosm and the macrocosm, Yatha Pinde, Tatha Brahmande. She also insisted that the written Shastra and the performed Prayoga be read together, very much like the wisdom method, Sutra Tantra connection in Buddhism. Kapilaji's quest was not so much to foreground the embellishments of classical performance, but to touch the core of stillness, which is the soul of movement. She knew that the best music is made in the silence between notes. Dance is not gymnastics, she would always say, but a search for the spine, physically and metaphorically. And she would always tell us, "Reed ki haddi ko dhoondo, usko seedha rakhna seekho." And that became her favorite refrain. She often reminded us that for education to be fully affirming, it must necessarily incorporate the arts. And of that exhortation, a very vibrant circle called Dhyana was seeded in a college that I worked with. And also what is today known as the ECA category for admissions in Delhi University owe their provenance to her. Today, of course, this evening marks a rare and luminous confluence. We gather to honor the memory of Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan and to listen to Professor Romila Thapar, who continues to challenge us to think afresh about our histories, our inheritances, and our futures, and as well as the political economy of knowledge production. We celebrate today two iconic iconoclasts working to counter the monocultures of the mind and decolonize research and scholarship. Both Kapila Vatsyayan and Romila Thapar refuse to be confined by the boundaries of conventional wisdom and canonical orthodoxies. Kapila Vatsyayan particularly said that the linearity of the Western canon is inadequate to grasp the simultaneity and the interconnectedness of the Indian experience. This insistence gave us both a historical and cultural lexicon, which saw India's tradition, as does Romilaji, as dynamic, porous, and plural. Professor Thapar, in her classic Past and Prejudice, warned against the dangers of projecting present-day expediencies onto the past. And I quote, "The past is not a handmaiden to contemporary politics," she said. "To use it as such is to diminish both history and ourselves." And at the heart of both their intellectual projects lies a profound commitment to pluralism. For Professor Thapar, there is no single essence of India, but a complex layering of identities, practices, history. They both represent the quintessential public intellectual, neither retreating into ivory towers. Both spoke in the public domain, unafraid to dissent, always. Kapilaji did this through institution building, and Professor Thapar has taken the path of dissent in times where historical reasoning and the line between dissent and sedition itself has become more porous. She has insisted on the historian's responsibility, and this seems like a cliche almost today, to speak truth to power, even when it has invited censure. For her, and I quote, "To remain silent is to collude in the distortion of history. The task of the historian is not merely to recover the past, but to defend the integrity of knowledge," end quote. A weaver of the tapestry of diversities to yield an understanding of the larger whole, Kapilaji insisted that the Indian imagination is not about categories, but correspondences. It's not about walls, but about doorways. And to engage with her work is to experience India as a vast mandala in which each part reflects and refracts the whole. So I really want to say, to celebrate these two iconic individuals who followed in the lineage of the founding mothers of, in some ways, the Indian Constitution, Durgabai Deshmukh, and several, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and several others, who reframed our understanding of engagement in civic life. Romila ji redefined the writing of early Indian history, shifting it away from dynasties and invasions towards social formations. She asked hard, uncomfortable questions, always. What do we mean by Aryan, by Hindu, by nation? Who constructs these categories, and for what purpose? For her, it was not enough to comfort the afflicted, but also to afflict the comfortable, especially when they are complacently, comfortably wrong. And both these iconic individuals have invoked our own traditions of the dissenting voices, of the polyphony of voices that really describes what India truly is, what vibrant India truly is. And she said that without the right to question, there is no history. Without the right to dissent, there is no democracy. And both these iconic individuals show us how women in particular play a distinctive and indispensable role in shaping knowledge, in shaping policy, in recognizing porosity and multivocality, and navigating to transcend the tensions between plural cultures and patrician, censorian, monolithic structures. So as we prepare to listen to Professor Romila Thapar this evening, we do so in the spirit of Kapila Vatsyayan's enduring legacy. Together, their lives and work represent the finest traditions of Indian scholarship, rigorous, plural, dissenting, and humane. In celebrating them, we also honor a vision of India itself, an India that is capacious, heterodox, democratic, and profoundly plural. May I join you all in requesting Professor, the one and only Professor Romila Thapar, to please address us. Thank you.
I must confess, looking around at the room, I feel absolutely overwhelmed. I just hope to God that you won't leave the room saying, what a bore, what a waste of time. But let me begin by offering my grateful thanks to the organizers of the Kapila Vatsyayan Memorial Lecture for doing me the honor of inviting me to give this lecture. It is indeed a great privilege. I first met Dr. Vatsyayan as a student when I briefly joined Miranda House in 1951. She was teaching English literature, which I read as a subsidiary course, and we had some very lively discussions on literary writing, among which I particularly remember the one on Christopher Marlowe and his plays, The Elizabethan Playwright. We didn't see eye to eye at all on Marlowe. Subsequently, we occasionally met in passing when she was associated with the India International Center, and I was then for a few months working in the library. And our passing chats were always brief, but full of fun and ideas. And I must confess that when I occasionally now come to the library and walk past, I miss those chats. For this occasion and this lecture, it was suggested to me that I should speak on history, or rather the contentious relationship that has now developed between professional history writing and that which goes by the name of history on various kinds of media, often written, it seems, by those unfamiliar with the historical method. Barring a few exceptions, much that they say tends to be the version of those who interpret the past as they wish, even if lacking proven evidence. It is therefore unacceptable to professional historians, but it is acceptable to members of the public who in turn quote it, perhaps because of the generally scant knowledge of history in this country. The sciences, being more technical, are not fantasized. The social sciences analyze how society functions and are therefore less technical and therefore more vulnerable. And history, of course, is an easy prey. I would like to argue that in this non-professional history, it is not limited to just the interpretation of history, as is popularly taught. There are at least 3 other areas affected. These are in the concepts we use to define our cultural heritage, in the propagation of poor quality history that quite alarmingly is contributing to lowering our educational standards, and in the political role of the ideology that is seeking to govern us. Without sounding alarmist, I believe that there should be a much fuller and sharper understanding of the kind of impact made on the thinking of our society from non-professional historical thinking or others, and why these ideas are being propagated. Professional history in India over the past half-century has undergone an immense change, both in the range and methods of analyzing sources and in explanations of what happened in the past. Historical research now goes far beyond dynastic history and incorporates aspects of social, economic, cultural, and environmental history. This increase in curiosity about the past, different aspects of the past, and the world we live in, therefore, is understandable and welcome. But answers have to be based on proven evidence, not on guesses and fantasies. History is no longer just an aspect of Indology, that is, providing information on the past. It is now an analytical discipline explaining the complexities of the past. And these concern not only the what and the where of past events, but also now the how and the why of what happened. Answering new questions has led to the emergence of new methods of both obtaining data and investigating it. This involves fresh interpretations that often question older knowledge. When existing interpretations become invalid, they are discarded by professional historians, as, for example, some long-held colonial readings of the Indian past. History helps us clarify what we call our cultural identity. This is central to the perception of who we are and what we are about, which in turn is pivotal to our understanding of ourselves and our cultures, in fact, our pattern of living. Stories about the past have been propagated in various ways in a variety of texts. Initially, the past was narrated as part of an oral tradition of what was believed might have happened. Some were then recorded as literature. Categories of texts in Sanskrit and Prakrit closer to history were the charitas, biographies, such as the famous Bana Bhatta's Harsha Charita, and the Vamshavalis, or chronicles of regions and dynasties, the best known being Kalhana's Rajatarangani. And complementing these, in the second millennium AD, were the Tarikh, the chronicles written in Persian, such as the Tarikh-e-Feroz Shahi. However, when it came to explaining the past, the deeper imprint was the colonial reconstruction of the Indian past to begin with. European readings of Asian history were obsessed by what they called Oriental despotism. Colonial writers maintained that the earlier rulers were despots, governing impoverished peasants through an oppressive bureaucracy. They argued that there was no notion of a state, since authority was in the hands of the despot. And these despots did not claim any legitimacy from the past. Therefore, history was not required. And given the absence of historical writing, obviously, colonial authority had to sit and write the history of India in accordance with what they believed it to be. And that's very important, the bias that comes into colonial writing. So the history of Indian history, the writing of Indian history began with colonial theories about the Indian past. Two theories in particular, which seem to be non-dying, were deeply ingrained and initially shaped Indian history. These were the Aryan theory of race and the two-nation theory. The Aryan theory assumes that history began when the subcontinent was settled by the Aryans, a superior race of migrants from Central Asia, it was argued. Upper caste Hindus claim descent and cultural origins, and Hinduism claims its roots from the Aryans. The other theory was, of course, the much better known two-nation theory, initially set out, and this is important to keep in mind, initially set out by James Mill in 1817 and thereabouts, the early 19th century. It was among the earliest theories of Indian history. It stated that India consisted of two nations, the Hindu and the Muslim, and that they were permanently hostile to each other. This theory ignored the fact that a nation depends on drawing diverse people together, whereas religion segregates them according to belief. These are two contrary processes, but they've been bundled into one by James Mill. Can nationalism, therefore, be qualified by a religious identity? And the communal interpretation which developed out of this two-nation theory was that the religious aggression between Hindus and Muslims explained the history of the second millennium AD. These interpretations of Indian history, the two interpretations, were questioned half a century ago by professional historians and a few others, and have been completely discarded by professional historians. However, these theories have been kept alive at the popular level, propagated in Hindutva ideology, and among some such popularizing views. They express them not in professional journals, but on various media. In professional circles, little attention is given to statements not backed by the required proven evidence. And neither of these theories initially were backed by very much evidence, except what the text said. What replaced these two theories among professional historians were various other explanations based explicitly on evidence that was verified and analyzed. There was a move away from colonial views that focused only on dynastic and political history and included other aspects of social and political functioning. This yielded other readings. Two substantial changes in professional history were linked to researching history. One was the use of a historical method, as we call it, as a procedure for research, and the second was interdisciplinary research leading to fresh sources and fresh questions. What do I mean by the historical method? It is the orderly investigation, step by step, of a historical problem. The first step in the collection is the collection of data from a range of sources, some of which may not have been consulted previously or been examined from diverse perspectives. The data must come from verified evidence. It cannot be hearsay on social media, WhatsApp, or whatever, or the wishful thinking of the writer concerned. The sources, both texts and artifacts from archaeology, must be studied and analyzed. This is particularly important where sources are in more than one language. Much of medieval history was earlier called the Muslim period, after the periodization of James Mill, and much of it was therefore based on Persian sources. Texts in Sanskrit and the regional languages are now being consulted more extensively, yielding differences in ways of thinking historically about those times, contradicting the colonial and subsequent communal interpretations. After assembling the evidence, the historian, the both causal and explanatory connections between people and events can then be examined by the historian. First the evidence, then comes the analysis and examination. These connections must draw on logical and rational arguments, not on guesses and probabilities dictated by the preferences of the writers. Seeking explanations from reading a text means an intensive study of the sources. Multiple questions are asked of these, such as, who was the author? Did his background influence what he wrote? Did he have an agenda? Was the agenda successfully conveyed by the text? Who was the audience for whom he wrote? Very important. The royal court, or a monastic community, or the larger public, because the orientation would change somewhat in accordance with the audience. Such questions are generally not centrally addressed in what claims to be history on the social media. This is perhaps because both the questions and the answers require a thoughtful reading and knowledge of the sources, as the answers can be very complicated. The induction of interdisciplinary history, that is, history moving out to other disciplines and having conversations with other disciplines, that helped in handling historical evidence, and this was done through more data and fresh questions. Historians became aware of methods of analysis used in other disciplines that could also be useful in historical research. For early history, this is particularly important because in addition to archaeology, which is an obvious aid, companion to history, some comparative use of analysis from linguistics or social anthropology are occasionally very suggestive, such as in discussing patterns of living and in defining cultures. Currently, there is also evidence from environmental studies and genetics. Genetics is the latest in the field. All this makes the analysis of the evidence not only richer, but much more insightful. For instance, religions are no longer viewed in splendid isolation, as they were until recently. They are now seen as closely related to the kind of societies in which they flourished. Hence, the many differences between one religion and another, depending on the society that it comes from. And this might help explain the form that they took, the kind of patrons they had, very important in religious studies, and their propagation. Let me give you an example of this change from earlier research and now. In the 18th and 19th century, William Jones and Max Muller studied the Vedic texts, and the main study was related to language and philology. These became the bedrock of Indian society, belief, and thought. Indo-Aryan was studied in isolation, despite being recognized as a cognate of Iranian Aryan and having hints of non-Aryan. These were ignored. The discovery and extensive excavation of sites of the Indus civilization in the early 20th century gave visibility to non-Aryan cultures and civilization in a major way. Later, the linguistic analysis of Vedic texts suggested the presence of some non-Indo-Aryan elements. This raised the question of whether there had been a cultural interaction, however limited, between Aryan and non-Aryan speakers. How did this reflect on the creation of Aryan culture? A question that is being much investigated and debated today. References to the dasas, for example, clearly non-Aryan in Vedic texts, began to receive greater attention. And genetic identities, always problematic, were now more fully discussed. Genetic analysis points us to DNA results with the hint of a migrant connection, perhaps. And we know that migrations into India from various directions were very frequent in history. This is an example of both interdisciplinary research and of research having initially an element of speculation until the establishing of incontrovertible evidence, which is why proven evidence is crucial to professional history. The identity of the Indo-Aryan speakers was the initial question. Were they indigenous to the subcontinent, as one popular belief goes, or were they migrants from further north who came to have a cultural interface with the local cultures in India, as held by many professional historians? Evidence relating to origins does not support a single uniform identity, unchanging and static for all time. What is of interest to historians today is precisely to see how cultural identities evolve, what aspect was taken from whom, what was given and to whom, and what was made of the ensuing processes. We know that wherever there have been migrations, populations have not just become mixed, but often fresh forms of culture have emerged from the mixtures. The many migrations of people coming from Central Asia over the last 2 millennia and settling in various parts of northern India, moving down into the peninsula, the Shakas, the Kushans, the Hunas, the Turushkas, these were not silent spectators of a static culture. A new culture emerged each time, as is reflected in the objects and thoughts that we have inherited from them. Establishing past identities has always been problematic. Many groups have intervened and mingled and defied segregation. Race in itself is a dated and debated concept, now largely discarded. The acculturation of communities settled in the subcontinent continued through history. Cultures mingled at many levels, new cultures emerged, and most found a niche for their particular idioms. Indian society was not singular and uniform. It was a society of plural articulations, just like other pre-modern societies evolving from diverse cultural forms. Adjustments among its various constituents brought agreement and disagreement, acceptance by some and resistance by others. There were differences of thought, opinion, and actions right through Indian history. The mid-first millennium BC to the mid-first millennium AD was a period of lively interchange, accompanied by both dissent and consent, which becomes clear when one reads the texts of the various groups involved. This is a requirement of acculturation. Brahmins referred to the Shramanas, that is, the Buddhists, the Jains, and the Ajivakas, as Nastikas, non-believers, therefore to be excluded. And that's why sometimes they're also called the Mlech. But since there was no majoritarianism in those days, dominance had to be asserted in other ways, in claims to closeness to power and in insisting on social hierarchies. Edicts of the Mauryan emperor Ashoka carry the plea that there be tolerance among what he calls Brahmanam Samanam, the Brahmins and the Shramans, as he refers to them. Patanjali, after all, was not joking when he compared the relationship between the Brahmins and the Shamans to that between the snake and the mongoose. Debate and dissent were not only familiar to Indian intellectuals of past times, but were recorded and discussed. Those in authority, in some instances, did try and silence them, but dissent continued to have a very strong presence in Indian culture. In the midst of this practice of openness, there came finally the collision of colonial conquest. This was the first time that even with a dominant power, there was really no direct acculturation. The law of sedition, the banning of books, the arrest of those who were critical of authority are known from the colonial encounter and have unfortunately continued. Unlike other previous rulers who came from outside, conquered and settled here, the colonial rulers for the first time did not settle in India. They were permanent aliens. The wealth of India was appropriated and directed to their homeland, Britain, and control over India was exercised by controlling the economy, but also, less directly, by imprinting their own comprehension of India onto the Indian middle class through education and other cultural idioms. Earlier, the imprint of this comprehension was open to debate, as was demonstrated in educational programs. But what is being propagated in history teaching today is a return to the discarded colonial theories. This is not the decolonization that it claims to be, since it supports colonial teachings. This supposedly new history claims to replace what others have been writing and teaching in the last 75 years in post-colonial times, much of which is conveniently labeled as Marxist, therefore said to be erroneous and dismissed. Let me briefly summarize the Hindutva version, which is now all-pervasive. It upholds colonial theories of the superiority of the Aryan race and the two-nation theory. It maintains that India was the territory within which was located the Pitri Bhumi, ancestral land of the Hindus, and the Punya Bhumi, the original home of the Aryans and of Hinduism, both necessary to Hindu identity. This is the pivot of its ideology that provides legitimation from its version of the past. And in this, the political requirements of the present are colonizing the past and reverting to colonial theories. How will this define our future? How is this in fact applied? The Aryan race is said to be indigenous to India and superior to all, ancestral to the Hindus and Hinduism. The Hindu, therefore, had a dominant status. The two nations, the Hindu and the Muslim, the latter established 1,000 years ago, were projected as having always been in conflict, with the latter denying the superior rights of the former. Therefore, the rightful future of India, it is argued, lies in its reverting to being a Hindu state, the Hindu Rashtra. It is maintained that the culture of India has always been a Hindu culture, although it is said to have suffered at the hands of the Nastikas to begin with, and then for the last 1,000 years, Hindus have been victimized by Muslims. The inheritance of Hindu superiority has now to be asserted. Since Hindus form the largest number, majoritarianism entered the calculation of most aspects of social and political life. It even colored nationalism. Nationalism was earlier qualified as anti-colonial nationalism, but is now more frequently referred to as religious or preferably Hindu nationalism to emphasize majoritarianism. It is no longer a national movement that includes every citizen as equal, since those of a particular religious community have priority. Once the two-nation theory is accepted, it is not too difficult to make the Hindu the primary citizen, with non-Hindus having a secondary status. We may well ask whether the single identity of a majority can claim to represent the entire society and culture, particularly in a country that has a diverse culture. Can a society as diverse as the Indian be reduced to having a single uniform heritage? A majority based on a single qualifier, at best, can only be the largest segment, for it is never the whole. Singular majoritarianism contradicts democracy, as also does acquiescence with the hierarchy of caste. Marginal concessions do not stop the circumventing of democracy. You may well ask, what does all this have to do with what is said to be history? Is it now being propagated on the media in order to replace professional history? This concerns a basic question, that of Indian pluralism. Will we still be able to nurture a society whose parameters are open to debate and discussion? A society is constituted of all kinds of people who, whatever culture they endorse, should have equal status as citizens. Or are we willing to confine our society to a single, limited, uniform way of living and thinking? Will there be only one explanation of the past and all others dismissed? Is culture going to be defined by the cultural idiom of a dominant community? Will variance be disallowed, as has happened already in some cultural spheres? These questions are not confined only to history, since the answers to them can alter the essence of both culture and religion in India. What will happen to the inherent pluralism of Hinduism, with its accommodation of diverse coexisting sects, which, for its believers, endows it with a unique richness? Will it retain or question the hierarchy that it endorses? Its pluralism makes its history recognizably different from that of the Abrahamic religions. The phases in the history of a religion evolve from the interface of cultures that occurs when historical changes interact with the existing forms of belief. Speaking very broadly of its history, the roots of religion in India would today go back to the Harappan religion of the Northwest and the megalithic cultures of the peninsula. Subsequent Vedic belief required large open-air altars for sacrificial rituals. These were followed by the Puranic texts, with a focus on other deities and new forms of worship involving icons located inside closed temples, and some in the open, scattered across the subcontinent. Then came the subcontinental efflorescence in the multiple regional forms of bhakti and the interface of cultures. Colonial times saw the emergence of the samajas. All these phases survived the centuries, but in varying strengths, their dialogue sometimes extending to other religions and sometimes not. Depending on regional factors, elements of other belief systems seeped in or else stayed away. A fascinating example of this is the word used for God in the Punjabi language and in Sikhism, which is Rab. In origin, the Arabic word for the same. It speaks immediately of a remarkable cultural universe. If our cultural identity is going to be molded by some inheritance from the past, and which we preserve and comprehend in the history we accept, then at least that history, as taught and read, has to be reliable and accurate. This requires ensuring that it is not being manipulated for political or other reasons. How is this to be ensured? This is where education becomes crucial. It requires trained and competent teachers who can encourage students to ask questions about what they are learning and can handle their inquiries with some knowledge. Both are given very little attention in current educational training. It was earlier assumed that history can be taught by anyone, since no special training was required. This is no longer the case. The historical method requires training, strict training. Furthermore, the past may not be tangible and visible, but it has not disappeared entirely. Either accidentally or deliberately, we come across artifacts and ideas from the past, even if as part of the present. We quote continuing traditions to justify our actions. If we are claiming historical heritage as essential, then the history it draws upon has to be accurate. History as an awareness of heritage begins in school. When we think of schools today, we think of state schools. We tend to forget that much of the schooling is in the hands of religious or quasi-religious institutions, the gurukuls, the shishu mandirs, the madrasas, the convents. There was a time when students in state schools were given an education that had some degree of quality in terms of a basic understanding of the world in which they lived. This is woefully scarce today. It is not thought necessary that students should be taught to comprehend and question, if they wish to, the society in which they live, even if questioning is a way of understanding it and ultimately necessary to its improvement. The purpose of education has become that of students having to memorize information from their textbooks, whether relevant or not, often in question-answer form, rather than being able to think and inquire. Education is fast becoming just a catechism. The textbooks currently prescribed merely provide information. That is why some of us in 2006 demanded that at least in the state schools, textbooks in all subjects be written or supervised by professionals in the subject. Today, the treatment of the subject by those in authority is so casual that sections of history are deliberately deleted. This is referred to as the rationalization of the syllabus, a term used by the NCERT. By this they mean that the Mughal period, or any other that they choose, need not be taught. The cover-up for such actions is the claim that it makes the curriculum easier for the student. But surely, deleting huge and important segments is not the answer, since that makes the subject opaque and difficult to follow, not to mention the explanation for the huge gaps. What answer will be given when the student asks, if he is allowed to ask, who were the Marathas fighting and why? Did nothing important happen in the 2 centuries, from the 16th to the 18th, the centuries that have been omitted? How will the presence of Mughal culture in various forms that surrounds us in our daily life be explained? One can hardly believe that this kind of opaque thinking is possible, especially among those claiming to be the educators. At the university level, the syllabus, if deleted, will result in reducing or eliminating the intellectual challenge of the subject. Not only is this new history questionable, but it does not reflect the debates that are often the focus in professional history. Reading lists have been pared down, and the writings of historians who are disapproved of have been removed. Lectures by visiting scholars, Indian or foreign, are disallowed unless permission is obtained from those controlling the university. It doesn't take too much to guess who will get permission and who will not. Some of us who were involved in the establishing of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in the 1970s have been appalled by the decimation that it has undergone in the last 10 years. This is not confined to the JNU alone, as other strong centers of the social sciences have also suffered. In establishing the JNU, we were determined to show that Indian academics were capable of establishing a university that would be highly respected, both at home and in the world outside, and respected for its academic program. In this we succeeded, but in the last decade, maintaining academic standards have been made extremely, to put it politely, problematic. As has been pointed out by many academics, this was done in various ways through appointing some substandard faculty, non-professionals dictating curriculum and syllabi, attempts to rescind the earlier appointed professors emeritus, curtail the freedom to research and teach what academics regard as meaningful, and such like. In 2020, the situation went beyond academic mechanisms, and a large, vicious mob was allowed into the campus of JNU, and students and faculty were physically attacked. On other occasions, there have been arrests of students for criticizing authority, and some of those arrested are in jail, still without a trial, despite the last 6 years of being there. Intellectually purposeful education requires thinking with freedom. Political controls on education silence intellectual creativity. Or is this control just another demonstration of the prevalent preference for anti-intellectualism? Speech can be silenced, but thought cannot be stilled. A university or a research institute is the apex of the education system. These are unique institutions entitled to freedom of expression, with teachers and students able to discuss their ideas without fear of being silenced. This has the potential of being the cradle of intellectual creativity. Ideally, this freedom should be extensive in society. Yet, this freedom in a university is not a luxury. It is a necessity in institutions of learning. It is a precondition to the advancement of knowledge. Existing knowledge cannot be left as static and disallowing change, because knowledge can only advance when existing knowledge is questioned and better explanations are sought. This is so clearly demonstrated wherever there have been advances in various disciplines, seen perhaps with greater clarity in the sciences. Why are we, therefore, so ready to subvert it? The history researched and written by professional historians is being replaced by interpretations that historians no longer hold. We are back to asserting the superiority of the Aryans and to explaining the history of medieval India by the two-nation theory. Social and economic history of any variety, even if clearly non-Marxist, is branded as Marxist and dismissed. There is little recognition that all knowledge, irrespective of what it is, requires explanation, and a dialectical approach can help analysis. This explains why it was used in Indian philosophical debates since early times. The philosophers of ancient India were not Marxists. The explanation can change, but new explanations have to be based on proven evidence and logical, rational arguments. It has now become fashionable to accuse academic historians for writing history in a style too dense to be easily comprehended. Therefore, the need for a pop version, even if it contradicts the history of professional historians. People read whatever the pop writers put out as history, since it's easily comprehended. It is surprising that intelligent persons can support such a meaningless explanation. Do they not pause to think that if the quality of education had not deteriorated so rapidly in recent years, academic history writing would have continued to be accessible as it had been for more than a century? The fault is not that of academic historians, but rather of those whose literacy has not kept pace with that of academic historians. Why are there no complaints about the density of writing in economics after the induction of mathematics into economics? In order to be widely and immediately accepted by the general public, the proponents of pop writing and their kind of history are active on the varied media. It brings instant publicity and huge audiences. It publicizes what anyone wishes to write, whether it be sensible or nonsensical, since there is none to assess it. Everyone is free to present what they want to. One has no objection to that. There has to be that freedom. It is part of the freedom of expression. However, when it is claimed that what is being presented is historically accurate, then the professional historian can legitimately object. The work of professional historians is often misquoted or quoted out of context, and sometimes even distorted. This becomes the excuse for targeting and trolling them. Correcting such claims is absurdly time-consuming, and such views cannot be stopped by correction. But surely the personal abuse of the professional historian is not called for. That it is not objected to is a reflection of the lack of civility in our society. Let me add, however, that there are some non-historians who nevertheless do take time off and do valuable work in historical research. They are often in communication with professional historians. They generally do not put their work on the media, but publish in selected journals. There is one more function of fake history, and that is an aspect that is deliberately not mentioned by those propagating it. This is its political function. Given the centrality of history to the construction of national and cultural identity, history cannot be hearsay or supporting an obvious agenda. If history has an agenda, it becomes apparent in the ideology that it propagates. This determines its intention. Its reading of the past is directed in such a way as to try and legitimize the making of society according to that agenda. There was a time when what were thought of as Indian values, rightly or wrongly, were said to be tolerance and non-violence. Today, these words are not even heard in public discourse, nor the ideas discussed. Anti-colonial nationalism assumed that nationalism was essentially secular, although allowing for religion as an important component of society. It was inclusive of all citizens and their undeniable rights as stated in the Constitution. It was therefore rooted in a society that was plural in character and endorsed multiculturalism. Today, it is thought to be replaced by religious nationalism, in which a particular religious majority can assert dominance. Some predictable attacks on secularism and the move to try and erase it from the Constitution indicate what religious nationalism may lead to. Will it stop with this? We come to the question with which I started and with which I shall end. Has the future been forsaken in all this? The question in our times is, will we be able to retrieve the vision we had as part of anti-colonial nationalism, of making India an independent, secular, democratic nation-state and society? In 1947, we envisaged becoming a society that had a heritage of freedom of thought that enabled debating, consent, and dissent. We were exploring the ways of establishing the rights of citizens. We rightly prided ourselves when we succeeded in establishing crucially essential rights, as, for example, adult franchise. So strong has been our commitment to a free society in the past that we were able to defeat, through an election, a significant attempt to silence us through using the powers of an emergency. This achievement had its roots in a cultural heritage of a history of both consent and dissent, and a commitment to humanism. But today we are enmeshed in a different reading of what is being projected as our cultural heritage. And we need to recognize its ramifications as well as its uses by those who author it. As indeed also of how education and the new agencies of propagation, such as the social and other media, are being subordinated to it and its political use. Not to mention the willful erasing of some of our more significant history in the process. Let us remind ourselves that today we are moving into another kind of universe, which neither we nor those who govern us comprehend. Our world is opening to the unknown impact of the unpredictable, namely, the uncertainty of how climate change will alter our environment and therefore our ways of living and thinking, as well as the other uncertainty of how artificial intelligence will force us to restructure our lives in as yet unthought of ways. At the moment, we do not know if we can turn them to our advantage or will we have to succumb to them. Let me, in concluding then, leave you with a couple of questions which have been rather bothering me as well. Do we have to keep struggling against pretend history and the damage it is doing, not only to what we know is our history, but also to our cultural heritage, our educational system, and political concerns? How can we return to exploring history as we once were doing, in a thoughtful and sensitively intelligent way, and understanding the past more closely and reliably, observing what links it to the present and what we might see as a viable future? Ultimately, the decision of what we should do is ours. Thank you.
I think we should have a standing ovation.
tears to my eyes.
Aditya, go ahead. Call the absolutely brilliant. Brilliant.
Seems that some of you would like to leave. That's something I'm quite used to when I teach. You know, sort of the end of the class or 5 minutes before that, some students want to leave always. I know you're not students, sorry. I've been, first of all, thank you so much, Romila, for this extraordinarily expansive, critical, imaginative lecture in which I think, if I may say so, many of your ideas have been compressed. Your ideas about time, the ideas about what is happening in the society today, and our understanding of what the past is and what history is that has sort of accompanied your work over so many decades. I've been asked to give you some concluding remarks. And one of the things that I also say in my class is that I'm sorry, I don't have any conclusions to give you. And students usually get quite upset about that because they want to have something to take away with them. But I don't think that would be also in the spirit of what Romila has talked about, particularly at the end of her talk in raising certain questions, which I personally find very inspiring, particularly those questions about the uncertainty that we seem to inhabit at this point of time, at this point of history, that not only Indian society or the Indian nation, but a kind of global nation or global humanity seems to be experiencing at this point of time. And it is this uncertainty that we are sort of faced with. And there's a few questions that I wanted to ask, and perhaps in a sort of a rambling mode, if I may, because I didn't have a pre-written script, if that's okay. I won't ramble for too long, because I've been told I should keep it very brief. I wonder whether the final points that you raised, Romila, about uncertainty and environmental climate change, the impacts of artificial intelligence that we hardly even know about, and yet we're pursuing with such great vigor without knowing the consequences of this, whether we can begin to frame the kind of social phenomena that you've been talking about, that you've been addressing, the, in a sense, distortions of history in social media, the notion of fake history, the sort of assumption in the sense of a rise of a certain notion of culture or a certain notion of the nation, whether we need to think about these, and I'm just raising questions again, whether we need to think about these within a kind of emerging context that is not just situated in this part of the world, but it's an emerging context that is global, and we also find this wanting to go back to an imagined past that perhaps never existed but is being glorified in other parts of the world, politically speaking, and you're all aware of this, I'm sure, that this is happening. And one wonders, you know, what exactly is going on. I wonder about this as a scholar of humanities and social sciences. Can I frame all of this in some other way? Of course, it has to do with power and legitimizing. But perhaps it has something to do with the manner in which humanity at large is responding or not responding to a tremendous crisis that it's facing today. In global terms, in terms of the environment, and of course, as I mentioned, as Romila mentioned, in terms of artificial intelligence, the invention of new technologies that we don't fully understand, and the breakdown of many social structures that seem to provide some sort of stability. So whether our understanding of history and the past and the proliferation of distortions of the past on social media can be understood or need to be understood in some different kind of a context, perhaps in relationship to modernity itself, as a reaction to modernity, religious nationalism itself, where modernity has displaced religion, particularly in the 19th century. So religion has to find its place again in some way. It has to reinvent itself because, as we all know, religion has been around much longer than modernity, or at least modernity understood in its European meanings. As the talk began, as your talk began, and particularly what Meenakshi and Suhas said prior to that regarding Kapilaji's work and your work, it struck me that in some ways, perhaps that you were looking at the same things in this, ancient Indian history. Kapilaji looked at Vedic ritual and Vedic texts, also in a context of looking at dance. But you both arrived at different conclusions about the way in which we can go about imagining that very same past, which has been labeled in some contexts as ancient Indian history, which of course also can be questioned, and that perhaps there was no particular convergence of this imagination. And that itself is a kind of freedom, that one has the freedom to, based on evidence, to think about and to imagine the past in different ways. And I think your work and the work of Kapilaji exemplifies that, the ways in which you both thought about this, if I may say so, political, cultural, civilizational entity called India, arriving at different kinds of conclusions, if I may say. And so there may not have been a convergence in terms of what you understood this to be, but a convergence in terms of the rigor and the criticality of your approaches to the so-called, the subject that you were dealing with. But another question that came up in my mind while you were talking, Romila, was of course, as you've been talking about history so much, is necessarily, I think, the question of time. Because you have been referring to time, particularly in the title of your talk. The past and the future, these are very crucial aspects of time. The present wasn't there, but the present is there, because it's from the present that both of these are being imagined always. And I asked myself a question, listening to you, where does time, if I may be slightly philosophical, where does time actually exist? And therefore also, where does history exist? Notwithstanding the question of evidence and rigor and criticality, where does history exist? History as a component or a function of time, so to speak. And I think that's, again, a very, from my point of view, a critical question. Where does it actually exist? And it seems to me that it has some existence, or perhaps not totally, in terms of language and imagination. And this imagination is always in the present. So there's some understanding that I need to develop, obviously, and you do that so beautifully, Romila, of the present as a location or the place of imagination and interpretation for this whole thing we call time, that we're so concerned about. Our very existence is based on this, without our even examining it most often. And so therefore, the present itself is being imagined. And the present contains within it, from your talk I've understood this, many different imaginations of itself, or has at least the capacity to be imagined in different ways. And I think this perhaps becomes very crucial when you talk about the future. Because there is a concern, as you have so wonderfully expressed, that the future is going to in some ways turn out to be monolithic. There is only one future that seems to be facing us. But I would like to think that the past and the present and the future can be imagined in multiple ways. And your work and the work of Kapilaji has been an intervention in the public space, not only in the intellectual spaces that we know of, that we've been so privileged to learn about, to study, to be impacted by, but also an intervention into the public spaces in the sense of not only intervening into public spaces, but that the intervention itself is a creation of a public space. So that what we consider to be a public space or a social process or a social fact of some kind isn't really one. It's always something that is being created, that has to be carved out. And each generation, in a sense, is carving this out. And yet, that remains extraordinarily fragile. So these questions that you raised about democracy, about freedom, about expression, these are fragile objects. These are fragile expressions of humanity. And they don't have a long history in that sense, if I can use that word. In fact, I was thinking even the professional historian doesn't have a very long history if you look at it. I don't know how long. But I don't know when professional historians actually came upon the scene. Before that, there was all this, probably this other stuff going on that you refer to in a sense. So that the creation of social processes, the creation of social spaces is something that needs to be continuously recreated, reinvented. And I think this is what we are facing today. We seem to think that once it has been done, then it'll continue in this way. But that's precisely why we require and we need people like Romila Thapar to remind us of those spaces and to urge us, to inspire us to see that it is our job, in a sense, to create those and to nurture those public spaces or any kind of spaces, intellectual spaces, spaces for humanity to thrive, because they are fundamentally uncertain spaces. And it is at this point of time in history that this uncertainty is becoming more and more pronounced and requires more and more nuanced and sensitive engagement with it. So I think I should just conclude with that, and thank you again so much, Romila. Thank you all for coming here today.
We'll have the national anthem now, please.
Jala